So today I want to talk about Sean O'Brien speaking at the Republican National Convention. I never in my life thought that I would see the president of one of the largest unions in the United States speak at the Republican National Convention. And yet last Monday, Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters made the horrific decision to get up in front of the Republican Party and talk unions to a group that's entire platform is pro employer and anti worker. When I saw his name on the RNC list, all I could wonder is what is Sean O'Brien thinking? What could he be trying to accomplish by showing up at the RNC in what would surely be seen as an endorsement for Trump and an endorsement for a party whose entire platform has been anti labor? Apparently, I was not the only one, as Vice President of the Teamsters John Palmer had similar questions. Only days before this speech, Palmer wrote, "If O'Brien is going to satisfy his ego, if he's going to pander and beg for the Republicans to abandon their anti union policies, then the Teamsters membership would be better served if O'Brien stayed at home." While this was quite true, I was still curious after all this. So I listened to Sean O'Brien's speech last Monday, hoping beyond hope that I would hear truth spoken to power. I hoped that it would be the kind of speech where the Republicans would shut his microphone off halfway through the speech, especially if he was calling out Republican policy under Project 2025 and the fact that he stood in a room full of billionaires and their associates who have fought against the Teamsters and other unions. I hoped he would call out Trump as in his entire history of anti union activity. Instead, I quickly drained into disappointment as a union president praised and encouraged Trump and several other fascist politicians that were present. I then became enraged as his rhetoric echoed an American first nationalism that has always divided workers and hurt the labor movement. What I heard that night was a scab, selling himself and his union out, while he spoke vaguely about these labor platitudes, about non American big business, without ever challenging the real power sitting in the room that he spoke to. And to make matters worse, his social media posts since last Monday have only echoed his position as a sellout to workers. So let's talk a little bit more about Sean O'Brien and his speech at the RNC. But before we delve into the speech itself, it's important to consider the context in which this speech was given. The point of such a convention is to ritualize the promotion of a candidate and to spell out the party strategy and position as people give speeches to endorse the chosen candidate of the party. When it comes to Donald Trump and the Republicans, that specifically means the promotion of vague populist attitudes that appeal to everyday workers, but don't actually address their plight and issues. It means fascistic rhetoric that shifts the blame from corporate donors sitting in that very room to vulnerable populations and fellow workers, which includes immigrants and LGBTQ people. It means the promotion of Donald Trump and his brand and the image that ignores his history of harming the working class. And it means the promotion of all of the context of Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation's Christian nationalist ideals. Through his mere presence at this event, even without actually saying a word, Sean O'Brien looked as if he was endorsing Donald Trump and all of this rhetoric surrounding him. Even without opening his mouth or saying a word, his name represented a union presence endorsing Trump. This immediately gives credence to the vague populist notion that Donald Trump supports American workers and their unions when this couldn't be further from the truth. Quite to the contrary, Project 2025 has promised to gut union organizing activity, violate worker rights, and create additional health and safety concerns for workers. The AFL-CIO has all of this outlined far better than I possibly could in this short video. But some highlights to consider are the elimination of child labor rules that protect children from working in the mines and meatpacking plants, the elimination of pro-union cards in favor of secret ballots, and the creation of loopholes for companies who commit OSHA violations, and perhaps the worst of all, the removal of anti-discrimination protections based on race and gender. So outside of being a scab and a sellout, What possible reason could Sean O'Brien have had for wanting to speak in front of this party who wants to see children working in meat plants and mining facilities? How does this benefit unions or workers? This was also made so much worse by the placement of Sean O'Brien's speech within the convention itself. His speech occurred after a series of people discussed their economic difficulties by blaming Biden and inflation for their problems, while praising Trump as providing solutions. Naturally, this was surrounded with a healthy coat of calls for deportation of immigrants and the other messages that I mentioned earlier. This is the context in which Sean O'Brien was introduced and spoke, and unless he directly countered this and all of these positions in his speech, which he of course did not, this is the way his speech would be understood by the people who watched him talk. He didn't have to say, "I endorse Trump" to promote Trump and his positions. But Sean O'Brien seemed to think this speech was still a good idea given all of this context. So let's see in his words why he thought it was a good idea.
We will create an agenda and work with a bipartisan coalition ready to accomplish something real for the American worker. And I don't care about getting criticized. It's an honor to be the first Teamster in our 121-year history to address the Republican National Convention. Several months ago, I asked the RNC and the DNC for the opportunity to speak. To be frank, when President Trump invited me to speak at this convention, there was political unrest on the left and on the right. Hard to believe. Anti-union groups demanded the president rescind his invitation. The left called me a traitor. And this is precisely why it's so important for me to be here today. Think about this. Think about this. The Teamsters are doing something correct. If the extremes in both parties think I shouldn't be on this stage.
I don't have answers as to why any of this makes sense in Sean O'Brien's head. In what way does Sean O'Brien think he's going to create a bipartisan outcome with the likes of Project 2025? Why is it an honor to be played as a fool and stand before a crowd of people who hate what you supposedly represent, while you play the role of a scab for your workers and for your union? Why wouldn't you expect the left to consider you a traitor when you decided to make it appear that you advocate for people who want to gut union power? Is he going to identify why the extreme right and the extreme left would be upset at his presence there, and how vastly different those reasons are? No, he doesn't answer any of these key questions. Instead, he pivots directly to praising Donald Trump and only reinforcing the implicit endorsement that I explained and mentioned about earlier.
President Trump had the backbone to open the doors to this Republican convention, and that's unprecedented. No other nominee in the race would have invited the Teamsters into this arena. Now, you can have whatever opinion you want, but one thing is clear. President Trump is a candidate who is not afraid of hearing from new, loud, and often critical voices. And I think we all can agree, whether people like him or they don't like him, in light of what happened to him on Saturday, he has proven to be one tough SOB.
Nothing like riling up Trump's base in support of him at the RNC to spell out true union solidarity, am I right? This is scab behavior. It is the behavior of someone who is selling out unions to a billionaire. The problem is, he doesn't stop there. He then goes on to praise several other Republican figures.
the Teamsters reached out to 8 Republican senators who stood up for railroad Teamsters over our fight for paid sick leave. Josh Hawley was one of them. We started talking. Senator Hawley changed his position on national right to work. Then we started walking. Senator Hawley walked a Teamsters picket line in St. Louis and a UAW picket line in Wentzville, Missouri. More than that, I want to recognize Senator Hawley for his direct, relentless, and pointed questioning of corporate talking heads, lawyers, CEOs, and apologists. He has shown he is not willing to accept their pillaging of working people's pocketbooks. I know from a career in negotiating that you get nowhere by slamming your fist on the table. The first step is to listen. The Teamsters and the GOP may not agree on many issues, but a growing group has shown the courage to sit down and consider points of view that aren't funded by big money think tanks. Senators like J.D. Vance, Roger Marshall, and Representatives Nicole Malliotakis, Mike Lawler, and Brian Fitzpatrick are among elected officials who truly care about working people.
First of all, none of these senators and representatives, with the possible exception of Brian Fitzpatrick, have done much of anything for working class people. The AFL-CIO has shown that their voting patterns overwhelmingly do not help workers. You can see here that none of the other people that were mentioned, these politicians, have voted more than 25% in favor of workers. One of them has a 0 here. How about that? And that's Senator J.D. Vance, who is the vice presidential nominee. Please keep that in mind if you have ever considered possibly voting for these people. Secondly, why is Sean O'Brien vague about what the GOP and the Teamsters disagree on? That's the part that we should be listening to and hearing if Sean O'Brien wanted to show any backbone here and actually speak up for unions. He could have at least mentioned something like a minimum wage increase. That would be the bare minimum of what he could ask for. But that said, when it comes to Josh Hawley in particular, we can see that he has an 11% rate of voting for workers. Is this guy really worth the near minute of speaking time and praise he received? Let's be far too generous here and give him way too much of the benefit of the doubt and say that he changed his mind on right to work and perhaps he did take a few photo opportunities and pretend to be union friendly recently. The thing is he's still the same fascist who raised his fist toward and then ran from the crowd on January 6th. This is still the same guy who had a problem with public unions, which includes teachers' unions. And he's the same guy who doubled down on his Christian nationalist rhetoric and flat out said, I'm sure some will say now that I'm calling America a Christian nation, and so I am. And some will say that I'm advocating Christian nationalism, and so I do. My question is there any other kind worth having? Is this really the guy that Sean O'Brien should be praising as pro-worker? After this, in what is the most sensible part of Sean O'Brien's speech, he rightfully does praise the work of UPS drivers and the Teamsters' efforts to keep fighting for their improved wages and working conditions, and then goes on to talk about the importance of democratic unions. This is naturally met with silence by the Republican crowd. However, his criticisms that follow about Amazon turn in a very odd direction.
Companies like Amazon are bigger than most national economies. Amazon is valued over $2 trillion. That makes it the 14th largest economy in the world. What is sickening is that Amazon has abandoned any national allegiance. Amazon's sole focus is on lining its own pockets. Remember, elites have no party, elites have no nation. Their loyalty is to the balance sheet and to the stock price at the expense of the American worker.
While I agree with Sean O'Brien here that corporations as a whole have no loyalty to workers and prioritize their balance sheets and stock prices over everything else, the nationalistic rhetoric here is extremely troublesome. The issue with these corporations is not that they lack national allegiance. An American corporation still has these very same issues with prioritizing stock prices and balance sheets and taking advantage of the labor of workers. A company does not suddenly become friendly to workers when it waves an American flag. We're not here to advocate for National Socialism, like we saw from some German labor movements in the 1930s right before they got eradicated. The goal is not to praise American corporations, but to support workers from all backgrounds. Further, this comment from Sean O'Brien that the elites have no party, elites have no nation, does nothing to help our cause in front of this group of people. Right-wingers and fascists have a tendency to misidentify elites not as the capitalists and corporations, as well as those with extreme wealth and power, but as any outgroup or hated group that they want to see punished in a culture war. If you need evidence that shows that this is happening right now, look no further than Sean O'Brien's tweet where he describes an article written by his best buddy Josh Hawley as 100% on point. Now, in this article, Hawley states, the C-suite long ago sold out the United States, shuttering factories in the homeland and gutting American jobs while using the profits to push diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the religion of the trans flag. Once upon a time, the head of General Motors could say, with an entirely straight face, what's good for GM is good for America. Those days are long over. Now, in addition to the false nostalgic rhetoric, we see some of Hawley's fascism rear its head here, as he makes the claim that it is these non-American corporations pushing the narrative of, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who are supporting and upholding trans identities. Josh Hawley does not support workers here, and neither does Sean O'Brien in his support of these statements. It's important to remember that corporations did not push diversity and trans identities. The acknowledgement of diversity has been fought for on a grassroots level by our fellow workers. Workers and the union they make up are in fact diverse, and despite Josh Hawley's wishes, these groups include women, people of color, and LGBTQ people. This is something that Sean O'Brien should be quite aware of, given that it's literally the first thing mentioned on the Teamsters' description of their own union. Read it right there. The Teamsters are diverse. It's important to remember that this diversity is a strength, as we all have far more in common with each other than any CEO or corporation, including American ones. That said, I encourage you to go back and read the rest of this article and see how Josh Hawley and by extension Sean O'Brien uphold an America First stance when it comes to corporations. Contrast this, of course, with the attitude of Sean Fain and the United Auto Workers, who earlier this year proudly supported Mexican auto workers, as they recognized that neither the auto industry nor the labor movement is nationalistically bound. Consider that Donald Trump targeted the UAW specifically for this in his RNC speech. This is the issue with Sean O'Brien being vague on this platform and defending nationalistic America First rhetoric. Republicans will hear this and blame China, they'll blame immigrants, and they'll blame trans people while they praise American corporations at the cost of fellow workers. This ends up being the problem with the majority of the rest of his speech. Even though Sean O'Brien makes a bunch of valid points, many of them come with a similar vagueness that allow Republican voters to fill in the gaps. He talks about essential workers in the pandemic, but again blames a vague concept of elites that does not tie to the Republicans in the very room that he speaks in. He mentions inflation, but does not tie it directly to corporate greed, leaving most people to associate it exclusively with Biden and with as the previous speakers had stated. When he speaks of trade policies that put Americans first, the people in that room are going to think about Trump's proposed tariffs against China. The amount of nationalistic rhetoric in this speech makes me question how anyone was able to look at this speech and praise Sean O'Brien for being pro labor, or to have a pro labor stance when he's speaking at the RNC. Quite to the contrary, he seemed to have empowered fascists, Christian nationalists, and faux populists by giving an implicit endorsement to Trump and an explicit endorsement of Josh Hawley and all the policies that both of them stand for, including Project 2025's anti-union positions. Sean O'Brien has acted as a scab and sold out workers in his own union in the name of an America First mentality. And this mentality will cause nothing but harm for workers. And to make matters worse, after doing all of this, Sean O'Brien went on Twitter and seemingly endorsed the one type of union and the one type of worker that none of us should actually support: a police union. Here we have a photo of him standing in front of a ton of police officers. Why? Because these very same police would be the first ones at a strike to be busting our heads. This is who Sean O'Brien has shown himself to be this week. And he has proven to be a sellout and a scab, and he is certainly not worthy of being president of the Teamsters. And as far as I'm concerned, he needs to be held accountable. So if you learned something here today, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. You can also check out the links in the description down below to join the Discord, where we have conversations on topics like these. Or if you feel inclined to and are financially able to do so, please do consider supporting the Patreon in the link below, as it goes a long way to helping me continue to work on making and researching these videos. But again, please only do so if you are on the financial place to do so. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara. Thank you so much for watching.